Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of betrayal, deception, and a deadly obsession. This is the story of Pupetta Maresca, a woman who climbed to the top of the criminal underworld but paid a heavy price for power. A tale of power, vengeance, and calculated violence. This case will leave you wondering, what drives someone to abandon the rules of society to rule a kingdom of chaos? And how far will one woman go to protect her throne? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of the Godmother, the rise and fall of Pupetta Maresca. Pupetta Maresca was born in 1945 in the gritty outskirts of Naples, a city caught in the throes of post-war chaos. Her family lived in a cramped apartment where peeling paint on the walls and a persistent draft were constant reminders of their poverty. Her father, a fishmonger, worked tirelessly to support the family, while her mother tried to keep their small household in order. Life in the Maresca home was hard, but for young Pupetta, it was also a training ground for survival. From a young age, she learned that life in Naples rewarded only the cunning and the ruthless. Even as a child, Pupetta stood out. Her sharp blue eyes seemed to pierce through people, and her commanding presence made her a leader among her peers. Other children followed her instinctively, trusting her bold decisions during the games they played in the alleyways. Adults, too, noticed something unusual about her. While most girls her age were content to stay close to home, Pupetta seemed drawn to the streets. The same streets were ruled by the Camorra, a sprawling criminal network that thrived in the shadows of Naples. The Camorra's influence reached into every corner of the city, from the markets to the docks, and Pupetta couldn't help but notice the power and respect its members commanded. Her parents, particularly her mother, tried to shield her from this dark world. They warned her about the dangers of associating with the men who controlled the streets, but their words only fueled her curiosity. Pupetta saw the Camorra not as a threat but as an opportunity. While her family struggled to make ends meet, the men in finely tailored suits who worked for the syndicates lived a life of wealth and respect. Pupetta couldn't resist the allure. She began running errands for small-time criminals, simple tasks like delivering packages or passing messages. Though dangerous, these jobs introduced her to a world that promised far more than her family's humble existence ever could. Her talent for navigating the streets did not go unnoticed. By the time she was 13, she had caught the eye of Gennaro, the Cobra Esposito, a rising star in the Camorra. Gennaro had earned his nickname through his ruthless efficiency and his ability to strike fear into anyone who crossed him. He was ambitious and cunning, a man destined for power, and he saw in Pupetta a reflection of his own drive. Unlike most women, who were relegated to the sidelines in the world of organized crime, Pupetta seemed determined to carve her own path. Gennaro began mentoring her, taking her under his wing and teaching her the rules of the underworld. He showed her how to think several steps ahead of her enemies, how to spot betrayal before it unfolded, and most importantly, how to command loyalty. For Pupetta, this was the education she had been waiting for. Her confidence grew with every lesson, and her tasks became more dangerous. She started smuggling small contraband through the back alleys of Naples, evading police and rival gangs with a precision that impressed even the most seasoned criminals. Her initiation into the Camorra came with a test of loyalty that would change her life forever. One of Gennaro's associates, a man Pupetta had trusted, betrayed the crew by selling information to a rival gang. The betrayal put their entire operation at risk, and Gennaro demanded swift retribution. To Pupetta, the solution was clear. She volunteered to carry out the punishment herself. Some thought her boldness was reckless, but Gennaro saw it as a sign of her potential. The task was brutal and unforgiving. Armed with a knife and a determination far beyond her years, Pupetta confronted the traitor in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. It was a night of blood and silence, and when it was over, Pupetta emerged victorious. The act marked a turning point in her life. She was no longer a curious teenager dabbling in crime. She was a full-fledged member of the Camorra, someone to be feared and respected. In the weeks that followed, word of her actions spread through the streets of Naples. Her reputation grew quickly, and with it came both opportunities and dangers. She began working closely with Gennaro on larger operations, including smuggling routes that spanned the Mediterranean. Her ability to remain calm under pressure and her knack for making calculated decisions made her indispensable to the crew. But her rise also attracted the attention of rival factions within the Camorra. Pupetta was no longer an anonymous figure in the background, she was a player in a deadly game of power and betrayal. Despite the growing risks, Pupetta thrived. She had found her place in a world that valued strength and cunning above all else. Yet, as her influence grew, so did the weight of her choices. The streets of Naples, with their narrow alleys and dark corners, were filled with secrets, and Pupetta was learning that power always came at a price. What she didn't yet realize was how high that price would be. The alliances she built and the enemies she made during her rise would shape her destiny in ways she could never have imagined. Pupetta's story was just beginning, but the foundation had been laid. She had stepped fully into the world of the Camorra, a world where loyalty could shift in an instant and betrayal often came from those closest to you. The girl from the slums had become something far more dangerous, a woman with ambition, a thirst for power, and the skills to take it. For now, she was untouchable, but in Naples, the streets had a way of evening the scales. And for someone like Pupetta, who lived by the knife, the shadow of retribution was never far behind. By the time Pupetta Maresca reached her early 20s, she had become an integral part of the Camorra's inner workings. Her reputation as a fierce and calculating figure spread through Naples, and Gennaro the Cobra Esposito had placed her at the center of his operations. However, as her influence grew, the stakes of the game became even higher. Power wasn't just something that could be earned, it had to be maintained. And that meant making difficult decisions. Pupetta's loyalty to Gennaro, while strong, would soon be tested in ways she never anticipated. Gennaro, who had long recognized Pupetta's ambition and brilliance, began to see her as more than just a trusted lieutenant. She was his equal, someone who had the potential to rise higher within the ranks of the Camorra. Yet, while Gennaro's faith in her was unwavering, others in the organization were not as convinced. Some of the older bosses resented her rising power, and there were murmurs of discontent within the crew. Among those who disapproved was Michele the smuggler Vital, the leader of a rival faction within the Camorra. Known for his flamboyance and reckless approach to business, Michele viewed Pupetta as a threat to his own dominance in the criminal underworld. Michele and Gennaro had long been rivals, each commanding a network of criminals that stretched across the city. But the growing friction between them would soon become personal. Gennaro, eager to expand his empire, saw the potential in a strategic alliance with Michele, and so, the two men arranged a marriage between Michele and Pupetta. For Gennaro, it was a way to unite their forces and solidify control over Naples. For Pupetta, the marriage was more of a business deal than a romantic endeavor. Though she knew that this alliance would place her in a position of power, she also knew that it would require sacrifices. The young woman, now in her prime, was accustomed to making her own rules and didn't take kindly to being manipulated by others. From the outset, it was clear that the marriage was not built on mutual affection. Michele, a man known for his flashy demeanor and extravagant lifestyle, was quickly overpowered by Pupetta's sharp intellect and meticulous planning. While he basked in the luxuries that came with their union, Pupetta quietly observed the cracks forming within their alliance. Michele was reckless and overconfident, often taking unnecessary risks in smuggling operations, much to Pupetta's dismay. He refused to heed her advice, and it wasn't long before his poor decisions started to erode the gains they had made. The tipping point came when Michele, against Pupetta's warnings, chose to involve himself in a high-stakes drug trafficking operation. The shipment, a vast quantity of heroin meant for distribution across Europe, was intercepted by law enforcement due to Michele's negligence. The loss was catastrophic, and the blow to their empire was felt throughout the city. Not only had the shipment been seized, but the police had also managed to trace the operation back to them. While Gennaro initially attempted to shield Pupetta from the consequences of Michele's failure, it was clear that this mistake would have far-reaching effects. Rumors began to circulate that Michele's lack of discipline was putting the Camorra at risk. The streets whispered that the Vital crew was losing its edge, and rivals, sensing vulnerability, began to circle. To make matters worse, the police, emboldened by their success in seizing the shipment, ramped up their investigations into the Camorra's operations. Pupetta's frustration with Michele reached a breaking point. She knew that if they didn't act swiftly to restore their standing, the Vital crew would be torn apart from within. Gennaro, too, seemed increasingly wary of Michela's leadership, and it became evident that the once powerful alliance between the two factions was fraying. But Pupetta had never been one to sit idly by when her survival was at stake. She began to subtly undermine Michela's position within the crew, using her influence to sway key members to her side. The more she worked behind the scenes, the more Michela's position seemed to weaken. Pupetta's charisma and calculated moves earned her the loyalty of several of Michela's closest men, and soon she was in control of key aspects of the operations. At the same time, she began taking matters into her own hands. One night, after another failed operation under Michela's watch, Pupetta made a bold decision. She would eliminate the problem once and for all. She knew that Michela's weakness was not only his arrogance but also his inability to protect his own crew. She began plotting his downfall, taking advantage of his overconfidence and his lack of foresight. The assassination of Michela Vitale came suddenly, and it sent shockwaves through the city. One morning as Michele stepped out of a cafe in the heart of Naples, a hail of gunfire rang out, leaving him lifeless on the sidewalk. His death was swift. The hit was orchestrated by Enzo the Jackal Lombardi, a rival boss who sought to exploit the Vitale crew's growing instability. For Pupetta, the loss of her husband was both a personal tragedy and a political challenge. But instead of retreating, she vowed to avenge his death. Pupetta wasted no time in seizing control. With Michele out of the picture, she assumed leadership of the Vitale crew. Her strategy was ruthless but effective. She swiftly solidified her position, pushing aside anyone who might challenge her authority. Those who had once supported Michele now fell in line, recognizing Pupetta's iron grip on the crew's operations. But her ascension to power was not without its challenges. As a woman in a male-dominated underworld, she faced constant skepticism from her peers. Some still saw her as Gennaro's protege rather than a force in her own right. However, she was determined to prove them all wrong. The fall of Michela Vitale marked the beginning of Pupetta's reign. With the Camorra fractured and rival factions on the rise, she would need to act swiftly to protect her new empire. As she prepared for the inevitable battles to come, one thing was certain. Pupetta Maresca had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The stage was set for the next chapter in her bloody rise to power. With Michela Vitale's death, Pupetta Maresca found herself at the helm of a criminal empire, a position few could have imagined her reaching just a few years earlier. The streets of Naples, once ruled by powerful men who had built their wealth on violence and intimidation, were now hers to command. But the transition was not easy. While the Camorra had long been a place where ruthlessness was rewarded, the arrival of a woman in such a powerful role was met with resistance. For many, Pupetta was still the Cobra's girl, the protege of Gennaro Esposito. Her rise to power didn't erase the skepticism many held toward her. The older men of the Camorra, who had seen generations of male leaders come and go, struggled to accept a woman in control. But Pupetta was no ordinary figure in the underworld. She wasn't content with mere survival, she wanted dominance. At first, her approach was one of subtlety. She didn't immediately seek to change everything, knowing the importance of maintaining a fragile balance of power. Her first priority was to stabilize the Vitale crew, which had been thrown into disarray by Michela's reckless leadership and subsequent death. The crew was scattered, demoralized, and vulnerable, and many of the men who had followed Michela's command were unsure whether they could trust the new leader. Pupetta needed to reassert her authority, and she did so with a quiet, calculated efficiency. She took the time to meet with the remaining lieutenants, listening to their concerns and offering them rewards for loyalty. Slowly but surely, she rebuilt the fractured organization, using both charm and coercion to win over the most influential members. As the crew's operations returned to full swing, Pupetta began expanding the Vitale empire. Under her leadership, the crew transitioned into more profitable ventures, such as international drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and money laundering. She was not simply a participant in the Camorra's business, she was its driving force. Pupetta had a knack for seeing the bigger picture, for understanding the global reach of the organization. She connected with other criminal groups, including cartels from South America and Eastern Europe, and forged alliances that made her crew stronger. However, her growing influence also attracted attention, some of it unwanted. Enzo the Jackal Lombardi, a rival boss with ambitions of his own, viewed Pupetta as a threat to his control over Naples' criminal enterprises. He had long been a player in the underworld, building a reputation for ruthless tactics and bloody retribution. Enzo had managed to carve out a profitable piece of the city's drug trade, but with Pupetta's rise, he saw his share slipping away. For a man like Enzo, who had built his empire through fear and intimidation, the prospect of a woman outmaneuvering him was unbearable. He knew that to maintain his power, he had to either eliminate Pupetta or force her into submission. The conflict between the two became inevitable. Enzo, who had his own network of informants, quickly learned of the lucrative shipments Pupetta was bringing into the city. His crew began to interfere with her operations, raiding her warehouses, sabotaging shipments, and intimidating suppliers. These disruptions were enough to cause friction within the ranks of the betrayal crew. Pupetta was no stranger to conflict. She had been raised in a world where betrayal was as common as breathing, but she knew that this conflict, if left unchecked, could lead to a full-blown war. Instead of reacting with the violence that many expected, Pupetta chose a different approach. She knew that direct confrontation would be risky, especially with law enforcement beginning to close in on Naples' criminal factions. Instead, she decided to dismantle Enzo's operation from within. Pupetta's cold, strategic mind took over. She sent subtle messages to Enzo's key associates, offering them more lucrative deals and appealing to their growing dissatisfaction with his leadership. One by one, Enzo's men began to turn against him, quietly betraying him in favor of Pupetta's superior organization. Meanwhile, Pupetta's own men tightened their grip on the city, strengthening alliances and cutting off Enzo's supply chains. She didn't need to destroy him with violence, she would simply starve him out. But not everyone within the Camorra was pleased with her actions. Some of the old guard saw her tactics as too subtle, too underhanded. They believed that a leader's strength should be demonstrated through bloodshed, not negotiation and manipulation. These critics began to voice their discontent, growing increasingly vocal about the growing influence of women in the organization. For them, Pupetta's rise was a sign of the times changing in ways they could not accept. As the months went by, the tension between Pupetta and Enzo reached a boiling point. The Jackal, realizing that his power was slipping away, decided that it was time to act decisively. He made a bold move, ordering a hit on one of Pupetta's top lieutenants in an attempt to destabilize her crew. The murder was a brutal and public statement meant to send a message that Enzo was still in control. But Pupetta was ready for the challenge. She knew that this moment would come, and she had already prepared for it. Within days of the hit, Pupetta launched a counterattack. A series of carefully executed bombings targeted Enzo's warehouses and storage facilities, crippling his operations and sending his men into disarray. At the same time, she orchestrated a high-profile heist that left Enzo's cartel scrambling to recover millions of dollars worth of drugs and weapons. Pupetta's ability to hit Enzo where it hurt most the bottom line was a testament to her growing understanding of the game. She wasn't just playing the game, she was changing it. The final blow came when Pupetta took one of Enzo's closest allies, a trusted lieutenant named Salvatore, and turned him against his boss. Salvatore had been one of Enzo's most loyal men, but like many others, he had grown disillusioned with the Jackal's leadership. Pupetta saw an opportunity and offered him a way out, an opportunity for power in her own organization. Salvatore, who had once seen Enzo as a father figure, quickly realized that the tides were turning. With Enzo's empire crumbling from within and his most trusted men now working for Pupetta, he was forced to retreat into the shadows. Pupetta's victory was swift, but it was also just the beginning. With Enzo out of the way, she was now the undisputed queen of Naples' criminal world. Her name was feared and respected, and her control over the city was nearly complete. Under her command, the Vidal crew expanded its operations, delving into drug trafficking and arms smuggling. Pupetta's strategic mind and ruthless efficiency earned her the nickname the Godmother, but her rise to power also made her enemies. But the war was far from over. There were still those who plotted against her, still enemies waiting to strike. Pupetta knew that she had secured a major victory, but she also knew that in the world she inhabited, power was never permanent. Those who rested on their laurels often ended up dead. As she sat in the center of her newfound empire, the weight of her position began to settle over her. She had become the leader she had always wanted to be, but she also realized that with great power came even greater danger. The question now wasn't whether she would survive, she knew she would. The real question was how far she was willing to go to protect everything she had built. Pupetta Maresca had become a dominant force in Naples, ruling over an empire built on calculated risks, ruthless decisions, and a mastery of manipulation. Her rise to power had been swift, and she had proven herself to be a leader unlike any the Camorra had seen. Yet as her influence expanded, so did the threats to her reign. Her enemies, both inside and outside the organization, were growing bolder, and the risks of holding on to power had never been greater. Despite her success, Pupetta knew that maintaining control over Naples required constant vigilance. The very same tactics that had brought her to power, subtle manipulation, strategic alliances, and exploiting weaknesses were now being used against her. Her position as the first woman to ever hold such a high status within the Camorra made her a target for those who felt threatened by her rise. Some of the old guard, still unwilling to accept the changing dynamics of the criminal world, saw her as a symbol of everything they despised. Her growing influence had unsettled the established order, and her enemies were plotting to undermine her at every turn. In the Underworld, power was fragile, and Pupetta had learned the hard way that trust was a luxury she could not afford. Even her closest allies were beginning to show cracks in their loyalty. Francesco, one of her most trusted lieutenants, had been a loyal follower since the early days of her rise. He had helped her build the Vidal crew into a formidable force, but recently his behavior had begun to change. He seemed to be growing increasingly independent, and there were whispers that he was trying to form alliances with rival factions. These rumors reached Pupetta's ears, and she knew that any disloyalty, no matter how small, could topple everything she had worked so hard to build. The betrayal came swiftly, and it was devastating. One evening, as the night descended over the city, Francesco disappeared. Pupetta's first thought was that he had gone into hiding, perhaps to escape the tightening noose around him. But the truth was far darker. Francesco had been planning to betray her all along. He had reached out to a powerful faction in Rome, offering to hand over control of her operations in exchange for protection. The treachery was a slap in the face to Pupetta, who had trusted Francesco like a brother. Now she was left with the grim task of cleaning up the mess he had created. As news of Francesco's defection spread, tensions within the Camorra reached a boiling point. Some of Pupetta's men began to question her leadership, wondering if she had lost her edge. She had once been the rising star, the woman who had taken control with ruthless precision, but now they saw vulnerability. The cracks in her empire were widening, and the pressure was mounting. The rival factions who had once been too cautious to challenge her were now emboldened, sensing an opportunity to strike. It wasn't just Francesco's betrayal that threatened Pupetta's rule. Law enforcement had been closing in on the Camorra, and despite her best efforts to keep the police at bay, the noose around her neck was tightening. Investigations into the drug and arms trade were gaining momentum, and several of her key operations had been compromised. The police, driven by the need to dismantle the most powerful crime syndicate in the country, were more determined than ever. Pupetta knew that the time was coming when she would have to face them head-on. But before she could deal with her enemies within the Camorra or the police, another threat emerged. A former ally had become her most dangerous adversary. Gennaro Esposito, the man who had once mentored her, who had helped shape her into the criminal mastermind she had become, had turned against her. In the years since his escape from prison, Gennaro had grown more power-hungry. His ambitions had expanded far beyond Naples, and he had begun to create alliances with other powerful groups outside the Camorra. Gennaro's ambitions now included taking control of all the crime syndicates in Italy, including Pupetta's. The news of Gennaro's betrayal came like a thunderclap. He had secretly begun to build his own network of loyalists, plotting to seize control of Naples and beyond. His reach extended far into the underworld, and the idea that he would challenge her for dominance in her own city was an insult Pupetta could not tolerate. The rivalry between the two was personal. Gennaro had been her mentor, her guide, and her greatest supporter. But now he was the enemy. Pupetta's response to this new threat was swift. She had no choice but to go on the offensive. She used her network of informants to track Gennaro's every move, knowing that the key to stopping him was to dismantle his operation piece by piece. She began striking at his associates, subtly undermining their confidence and loyalty. One by one, Gennaro's men began to turn against him. It wasn't a quick victory. Gennaro's forces were deeply entrenched, and the battle for control of Naples would be long and bloody. But Pupetta was prepared to fight for her empire, no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed, the streets of Naples became a battleground. Gennaro and Pupetta engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse, each trying to outmaneuver the other. Their forces clashed in violent confrontations, each one more brutal than the last. Pupetta's reputation as a master strategist was put to the test as she fought not only to protect her city but to prove that she was the rightful queen of Naples. But the personal toll of this battle began to weigh heavily on her. Her closest allies had begun to question her methods. She had once been able to trust them implicitly, but now doubt had begun to seep in. Pupetta's empire was crumbling under the weight of internal strife, betrayal, and external pressure. Francesco's defection, Gennaro's challenge, and the ever-present threat of the police left her fighting on multiple fronts. Every decision she made seemed to lead to more bloodshed, and each day brought new risks to her life and the lives of those she cared about. It was during this period of uncertainty that the ultimate betrayal came. A trusted member of her inner circle, someone who had been with her since the beginning, had been secretly working with Gennaro all along. The revelation rocked Pupetta to her core, and for the first time since her rise to power, she found herself questioning everything. The people she had relied on, the men she had trusted, had all turned against her. With Gennaro's forces growing stronger and the police closing in, Pupetta was forced into a corner. The fight for control of Naples had escalated beyond anything she had ever imagined. As the battle raged on, the question remained, would Pupetta be able to keep her empire intact, or would she be brought down by the very people she had once trusted? The stakes had never been higher, and the path to victory was uncertain. What was clear, however, was that Pupetta's strength would be tested like never before, and her fate now lay in her own hands. Pupetta Maresca's empire, once a force to be reckoned with, was now on the brink of collapse. Every step she took seemed to lead her deeper into a labyrinth of betrayal and danger. With her former mentor Gennaro Esposito, now her most dangerous adversary, and the police closing in on her every move, the Queen of Naples found herself facing the most perilous challenge of her life. She had fought tooth and nail to reach the top of the criminal world, but now she was on the verge of losing everything she had worked for. The weight of her circumstances began to take a toll. Pupetta had always prided herself on her cold, calculated decisions, her ability to remain level-headed in the face of danger. But as the stakes grew higher, her resolve began to crack. The constant threats from within the Camorra, Gennaro's ever-growing influence, and the relentless pursuit of law enforcement had left her isolated, with only a handful of loyal allies remaining. Pupetta knew that the time had come to make a choice. Either she could fight on, risking everything, or she could disappear, leaving behind the life she had built. For a brief moment she entertained the idea of fleeing, of escaping Naples and the chaos that had consumed her world. But deep down, she knew that running would be a betrayal of everything she had stood for. Her pride, her ambition, and the thirst for revenge all pushed her to stay. She would not go down without a fight. With the full weight of the Camorra, Gennaro's forces, and the police pressing in from all sides, Pupetta decided to take matters into her own hands. She began to rebuild her alliances, carefully selecting those who still owed her loyalty. She sought out the few men who had remained faithful, offering them incentives they couldn't refuse. Together, they formed a plan, a desperate, last-ditch effort to reclaim control of Naples. The plan was dangerous, perhaps even suicidal. To take down Gennaro and his growing faction, Pupetta would have to strike at the heart of his operation, targeting the men he trusted most. She knew that the element of surprise would be key. Gennaro would never expect her to strike so soon, and he certainly wouldn't anticipate her attacking with such ruthless precision. Pupetta's strategy was simple: divide and conquer. She would turn Gennaro's men against him, sowing distrust and confusion, before moving in to eliminate the threat once and for all. The execution of the plan was brutal. One by one, Gennaro's top lieutenants began to fall, their loyalty shattered by the subtle manipulations that Pupetta had orchestrated. What started as whispers of doubt soon turned into open rebellion. Pupetta's agents worked in the shadows, picking off Gennaro's most trusted men and replacing them with loyalists of their own. Each attack was swift, silent, and deadly, designed to create chaos and weaken Gennaro's control over his own forces. As Gennaro's empire began to crumble, the police, sensing an opportunity, intensified their efforts to capture both him and Pupetta. The law enforcement agencies had been closing in on the Camorra for months, gathering evidence, tracking shipments, and monitoring communications. With Gennaro's position weakening, they believed that this was their chance to strike at the heart of Naples' criminal underworld. Yet, unbeknownst to them, Pupetta had anticipated their every move. She had carefully placed her most trusted men within the police force, ensuring that every step of their investigation was monitored. As the police closed in on Gennaro, Pupetta made her move. She engineered a series of false leads, drawing the attention of the authorities away from her true operations. At the same time, she continued her assault on Gennaro's men, forcing them to retreat, regroup, and fight for survival. What had once been a unified force under Gennaro's command was now a disorganized, scattered faction ripe for the taking. But as the situation became more chaotic, a new problem emerged. Francesco, the lieutenant who had once betrayed her, returned to the scene. Having been cast aside by Gennaro's faction, he now sought to align himself with whoever could offer him the most power. Seeing an opportunity to regain favor, he tried to negotiate an alliance with Pupetta. He knew that Gennaro's empire was falling apart, and he believed that if he threw his lot in with the remaining strong player in the game, he could carve out a new position for himself. Pupetta, however, was not fooled. Francesco's return only served to deepen her suspicions. She knew that his betrayal had been motivated by greed and ambition, and that he would likely turn on her the moment it suited him. Despite the apparent desperation of the situation, she could not afford to trust him. Her empire was already crumbling, and allowing Francesco back into her fold could only lead to more instability. As the battle for control of Naples escalated, the final confrontation between Pupetta and Gennaro became inevitable. Both sides had been weakened by infighting, betrayal, and the constant pressure of law enforcement. The time had come for a decisive battle, one that would determine the future of the Camorra and the criminal underworld of Naples. In the dead of night, as the city's streets lay cloaked in darkness, Pupetta's forces made their final assault on Gennaro's stronghold. It was a bloody, violent affair, with neither side willing to give quarter. Gennaro's loyalists fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and ultimately overwhelmed. Pupetta's men stormed the compound, cutting down Gennaro's most trusted lieutenants one by one. At the heart of the battle, Pupetta came face to face with her former mentor. Gennaro, once the man who had taught her everything she knew, now stood as her greatest enemy. The two locked eyes, and for a moment there was a strange recognition between them, a shared history, a bond that had once been unbreakable. But that bond was now shattered, irreparably damaged by ambition, betrayal, and the thirst for power. With a final, decisive blow, Pupetta ended Gennaro's reign. Her victory was hard-earned, but it came at a great cost. As the dust settled and the last remnants of Gennaro's forces were eliminated, Pupetta stood alone in the ruins of her former empire. She had triumphed, but the victory felt hollow. The city of Naples, once her kingdom, now lay in ruins, and she was left to pick up the pieces. The price of power had been higher than she had ever imagined. In her quest to become the Queen of Naples, Pupetta had lost everything: her friends, her allies, her sense of security. Now, with Gennaro dead and her enemies vanquished, she stood at the precipice, uncertain of what the future held. Would she be able to rebuild once more, or was this the end of the road for the notorious Godmother? Only time would tell. Thank you for watching Mystery Minds. If you found the story as chilling and fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of true crime. What do you think of Pupetta Maresca's rise and fall? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, stay curious and stay safe.